On today's podcast of Mamas con Ganas, I'm interviewing Professor John Muteba Rahier, Professor of Anthropology in African and African Diaspora Studies, Director of the Observatory of Justice for Afro-descendants in Latin America, otherwise known as OJALA, and Professor Rahier is also an author in many books. Thank you so much, Professor, for being with us today.
It's my pleasure. Thank you very much.
Mamacita, I'm really excited about bringing this topic and Professor Rahier in particular, because I wanted to, this is an ongoing discussion. The discussion that I'm having about racism on my platform is not something that's gonna just be in fashion right now and then it's gonna go away. I believe it's a topic that's very, very important for us to discuss. And I wanted to bring somebody who is a specialist in the topic. And Professor Rahier is definitely a specialist. I was looking him up. I said, I have to interview him because not only does he specialize in multiculturalism in Latin America, but also ethno-racial law in Latin America. And his organization, OJALA, is actually doing something very real to help discrimination, to help get rid of discrimination in Latin America. So, Professor, before we go on into, educating our audience and enlightening them on all the things that you know about racism in Latin America, can you tell us a little bit about your background, where you come from, and then also why you're so passionate about this subject?
Thank you very much for the question. I was born in the Congo, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Congo DRC, at the end of the colonial period, 1959. But I grew up in Belgium. My parents, my father was a colonial man and my mother a colonized woman. And I grew up in Belgium till I went to university in Belgium, and my graduate school, I did it in Paris. And basically, I have been interested in the African diaspora in Latin America because for personal reasons that I could explain, but it might be too long, I identified very much with the diaspora, with the African diaspora, and particularly in the Americas, much more so than with the Congolese community that was living in Belgium at the time of my youth, for a number of reasons. And so the displacement of the communities of the African diaspora in the Americas was a source of inspiration and identification. I identified very much with their displacement. And that is what led me to be interested in Latin America when I went to school at the university. And that's what, led me to, at some point, go to Ecuador and do my doctoral dissertation on a Black community in the province of Esmeraldas in the northern part of Ecuador. It's basically anti-racism that led me to get involved in that.
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. It's very interesting. Now, so let's talk a little bit about racism in Latin America, because I know that a lot of Latin Americans are very much opposed to even the idea that it even actually exists. I'm Venezuelan. I know a lot of Venezuelans who say racism doesn't exist. A lot of Latin Americans in general kind of deny its existence. Can you give us a little bit of the background? And because I know we had a conversation before, and this can go on for a very long time, but a very important movement happened in Latin America during the 1980s and all of that. So sort of give us a little backdrop as to racism in Latin America.
Yes. So when we think about the race relations in Latin America, in Latin American societies, which are settler societies, just like the United States is, which is that these are societies that became independent and was led since the end of the obtention of independence by the groups of settlers who were living there. And this is a very different set of independences that you had in Africa, for instance. In Africa, the indigenous people became independent and pushed away the colonizers and the settlers in some cases. In Latin America, it's the settlers who became independent, and the racial order that had been taking place during the colonial period remained in place, where you had the descendants of the Spaniards, who were the criollos, remained in charge and became, and the indigenous Native Americans and blacks remained at the bottom.
So were there different hierarchies and different groups of people that were classed as a specific and given a specific identity?
Yeah, so that's how you have the birth of the white or white mestizo elite in Latin America come out of those who were in charge of the colonial, the colonial economy at the time, and who, and the descendants remained in charge and run the societies. And the people who were at the bottom, their employees or their slaves, kept the same position. Nothing changed for them. Independence didn't, really transform the racial order of Latin American societies that had been taking shape during the colonial period. So the interesting thing then, I'm talking here very generally, taking the entire region. Now, of course, we have to think, we have to be aware of the fact that each national context in Latin America is different. So we cannot make it difficult to make a generalization. But I'm talking about nonetheless, I'm talking about the entire region now. And so these things has happened differently in different national contexts. But what has happened is that the leaders of the independences in Latin America then began developing after independence what has been called the ideology of mestizaje, which is an ideology of national identity. And they were preoccupied by, presenting their individual nations as profoundly different from Spain and from European nations. And in what were they different? They were different because they had somewhat incorporated or Indian blood. That's what ideology of mestizaje. Mestizaje referring to the very specific race mixing, which is between Spaniards or Europeans and indigenous or Native Americans, and leaving outside in general the blacks. Now, of course, Cuba, there are some exceptions. In Cuba, mestizaje means perhaps something somewhat different from what it means in the Andean region, for instance. But in general, so they then developed these ideologies of mestizaje, saying that we are, we are all mixed up, and then there is no racism in our societies, unlike what's going on in North America, and we are basically profoundly different societies from those societies because of that mestizaje. So there was some sort of a celebration of Native American and white mixing at the detriment of excluding Afro-descendants, and with this ideology, there was no acknowledgement of the presence or contribution of Afro-descendants or even indigenous people. In what in my work I call the ideological biology of national identity, included indigenous people only in so long as they were going through the process of blanqueamiento, the process of whitening, either or usually both kinds of whitening, which is biologically, which is marrying right, para mejorar la raza, it's an expression.
Sí, which is a big expression in Latin America, to better the race. For those of you who don't speak Spanish, is a very well-known term everywhere, you know.
Yeah. So it's blanqueamiento, a process of whitening, but also through cultural whitening, which is that by adopting, European ways of being in the world and
through perhaps, I imagine so, is very much through religion, right? And the holidays.
Religion, a whole bunch of all areas, even table manners, way of dressing, and so on, but this ideology had for consequence that it was invisibilizing, making invisible the communities of indigenous people who were not
mixing,
and as well as the Afro-descendants who were not included within. And so that's why, in many Latin American countries, Black social movements in the 70s were fighting against their invisibilization, because the official story about the nation back then was a nation in which you only had mestizos and white mestizos, and the contribution of Afro-descendants was never really acknowledged. And so this is the reality that is, in a way or other, characterizing the entire region. Ideology of mestizaje in Spanish-speaking Latin America, an ideology of democracia racial in Brazil, but which is also based on racial mixing, where you have some sort of a celebration ideologically of racial mixing. But in the facts, you had, very acute practices of discrimination.
Now that, okay, let me kind of summarize to make sure that I understand what you're saying. You're saying, okay, so the Spaniards came and they colonized the Americas. When the Americas and the settlers wanted to gain independence as a way to sort of adopt a national identity, because at that point they said, okay, well, you're Spaniard and I'm Colombian, Venezuelan, Argentine, or whatever it was. And when they did that, they sort of said, okay, well, I guess the ideal of what we are is a mix between the Spaniards and the Indians. And so long as they mix with us, they can fit into that national identity. But the Afro-descendants were basically marginalized out of that identity. And also the Indians, who were not mixing with the Spaniards or with the race that was lighter, were also sort of marginalized and put aside. And they didn't fit into that ideology of what it meant to be Colombian, Venezuelan, Brazilian, or so on, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly, you got exactly right. So behind that ideology that says that here, aquí no hay racismo, here we have no racism, todos tenemos un poco de cada cosa en nuestra sangre, en nuestras venas. We all have a little bit of all the blood in our veins, so that's why there is no racism here, was in fact a big lie, because behind that, in the everyday realities, you had abject practices of discrimination and in some cases, brutality in an unjust system vis-a-vis non-white mestizo population.
That's very interesting, because there it is, in a way, we are a population that has more mix. Would you say we have more mix than in the North America, for example? Well, now you're seeing more mix here, but in the past, would you say that Latin America was mixing more than the United States, or not?
No, I don't. No, because the systems are
completely different.
Different. But what I'm trying to say is that the story that we are all mixed was a subterfuge, an occasion was used in order to mask and hide the actual
reality for the Afro-descendants.
Okay. Racial order, of the racial order in this society. Which
I've learned a word that I had never learned before, which was the word pigmentocracy.
Yes.
So this is sort of a racial, can you tell us a little bit what is pigmentocracy?
Pigmentocracy refers to basically the existence of a racial order is that it refers to the fact that a very particular, a specific pigment, which is understood as being a white phenotype or skin color, is on top. And it's an expression that is used to refer to the fact that you have a very high correlation in Latin American countries between social classes and ethno-racial identity. So the higher you go in the socio-economic political ladder, the lighter you will find individuals, and the lower you go, the browner and blacker these individuals will be on the socioeconomic.
So in other words, the darker you are, the more likely you are to be poor and uneducated, and the lighter you are, the more social and economic power you're more likely to have. Is that correct?
Exactly. And then, of course, with all of that, with that system in place, you had also the development of a number of stereotypical representations of the people, of the various people living together in that society, in which white folks were represented and have been represented as more educated, more polite, more proper, and so on, while Afro-descendants, for instance, have been depicted as rapists, social predators, thieves, and so forth and so on. The uneducated and dangerous individuals. And so these are representations that, in fact, and this, I've done some work on representations of Black people in the press in Ecuador.
Oh yes, that was very interesting. Tell us a little bit about that, because I don't know if any mamacita, I'm sure you do, because we're all soccer lovers in Latin America, and we watched the World Cup. So your study, was it on the soccer players, right? One of your studies?
No, I worked on the participation of Ecuador in the 2006 World Cup. And those who like football will remember that, or soccer, will remember that the performance of the Ecuadorian team was very good and quite surprising at that World Cup. And they went far, particularly thanks to the performance of Afro-Ecuadorian players.
Yes.
El famoso Tin Delgado, who was the peak of his career back then, and I've done some research on the way people in social media and in the press were writing and talking about the team, and even though the team was bringing a lot of pride, national pride, to Ecuador, nonetheless, in these messages at which I look, I'll be glad to send you, by the way, that piece. I should have sent it to you, because
we can share it. Send it to me and we'll put it on the blog. Actually, and now that you're reminding me, I'm going to be attaching links to a lot of Professor Rahier's articles and the stuff that he does, because what you can learn is so fascinating. But go ahead with your story.
Thank you. Yes. So, and then basically you could see that the way journalists or people in general who were writing about the performances and the matches in which Ecuador was participating was reproducing that externality, that non-citizenship of Afro-descendants.
Non-citizenship. So it's almost like they were not seen as being Ecuadorian.
Oh yeah. So that's exactly right. Not almost. They were seen. So even progressist intellectuals were, without realizing it, were reproducing that externality to citizenship that Afro-Ecuadorian were basically suffering from. And so the stereotyping and the way you understand the lives of Afro-descendants are made sense of by non-Afro-descendants in these contexts, racist contexts, anti-Black racist contexts, is very brutal, and can have a profound effects on the lives of those who are subjected to it, you know. And so I then engaged in demonstrating. This was I also engaged in looking at the representation of Black people in the press in Ecuador in general, independently from football. The representation of as a matter of fact, of Afro-descendants as football player is part of the stereotypical representation, because you have usually Afro-descendants are represented as good in two things: sport and music.
And music.
And so for the rest of everything else, they are basically looked at as, if they go in these spaces, as out of place. They've had to suffer, you know, a lot of bad treatment. But I forgot about what I was saying. So the period of ideological mestizaje, which goes from the independences to the 1980s, was a period that I call monocultural mestizaje, where the population of nation states are imagined as being homogeneous, as being all mestizos. You know, this is part of the ideology that I was just talking about. But then there is something very interesting that takes place beginning in the late 1980s and mostly in the 1990s, and still ongoing now, which has been, there has been what scholars have been referring to a multicultural turn in the region. And that multicultural turn was characterized by a change of constitutions, adoption of new constitutions, or the adoption of constitutional reforms, as well as the adoption of special laws that recognize the existence for the first time in the constitutions, usually in the first articles of the new constitutions, the multiracial, multicultural, plurinational, some will use that vocabulary, character of these national populations. So we are not, with the multicultural turn, the official story or the official history of these nation states is no longer characterized by a reproduction of the ideology of mestizaje, but now recognizes the existence of indigenous people and Afro-descendants along with white and white mestizos. You understand? So,
and why do you have this happen in that time period? Why were the 1980s the time where this took place?
There are various factors to explain that. You have on one side the activism of indigenous groups as well as Black communities for their right, for the recognition of their right, for the recognition of their existence, for the end of invisibilization, and so on. You will remember, maybe some of your some people in the audience will remember that in 1992, so in the beginning of the 90s, you had a major process during which Spain wanted to celebrate the 500 years of discovery, because 1492, 1992. And that provoked, of course, a reaction of the political organizations of indigenous people and Afro-descendants, who reacted to that and said, you know, 500 years of exploitation. These were not, we were not discovered. We could not discover ourselves, and so on. So this was a very critique of the Eurocentric perspective that was behind these 500 years of discovery, the celebration. And so around, and thanks to that reaction of indigenous people and Afro-descendants, Spain, by the way, then, which initially didn't plan to fund activities during the celebration that will give visibility to these organizations, decided to do so. And that reinforced, so there was a vigor of these in the early 90s, you know, in preparation of 92, a vigor of organizations. And which were demanding more and more specifically the recognition of their rights. That's one factor. Another factor as well is the fact that many countries, the countries of the global north, in Europe, North America, who had who underwent a multicultural turn of their own in the 1970s, began demanding to Latin American nation states who were applying for loans or for support for certain programs they might have had, demanded from these countries that we will help you with these things and these loans only once you adopt multicultural recognition, multiculturalism as a system that will organize your societies in a more democratic way, where the minorities, the ethno-racial minorities, will have a say, which they didn't have so until then. And so,
what were these organizations, for example, some of the organizations that push this?
Inter-American Band of Development, IMF, World Bank, the various agencies of the UN, UNESCO, etc. So that became, this is known by, the scholars who have been working on that, is that this push where the influence of of international influence from these organizations and countries, because you also had the bilateral arrangements that the United States might have with all of the Latin American countries, as well as France, Spain, and so on, and which were also demanding the same thing. So,
and it's interesting because it's an economic push.
Oh yeah.
It's more like, you want our money, then you adopt multiculturalism. So in a way, it wasn't even done as a way to get them right. It was just as a way to, okay, let me just get the funds to do this. It's very interesting.
Exactly right. That's exactly right. You have to know that in many countries, multiculturalism is adopted as a principle to organize the functioning of the state during the period that has been called neoliberalism. And so in the 1990s, most countries in the region adopt multiculturalism while their governments, their national governments, is dominated by political parties from the political right, from the right, and which is
a bit contradictory, no?
Yeah. Well,
contradictory.
One would think that multiculturalism is going to be adopted when you have governments dominated by political parties from the left. But no, in fact, it begins in the case of Ecuador, for instance. Ecuador has had two constitutions which adopted multiculturalism, and the first one in 1998 during a government which was dominated by the political party called Los Social Cristianos, the social Christians, which is on the right, the political right. And for instance, but it has been the case even in Brazil and so on. So in Colombia. So this is so this is the first wave in the 2000s. Then you had in the 90s, in the 2000s, you had a wave of leftist governments, which eventually reinterpreted and went further in some of the reforms, multiculturalist reforms that took place. But so this multicultural turn then was characterized by the adoption of what we call legal instruments, so laws, articles of laws or constitutions, which of two kinds. One was to recognize and hopefully protect the collective rights of indigenous people and Afro-descendants, sometimes, but mostly for indigenous people, collective rights about the use of their land, the territory, a bit like the reservation that you have here in the United States for Native Americans. You've had the adoption of plural legal systems where for certain issues, the legal system of indigenous people will be the one, in use in some regions where on the territories of the indigenous people, and so on. Ethno-education, the systems of education in which the language used is not Spanish, but it is one of the indigenous language used, the indigenous language used in a specific community, and so forth. So these are collective rights. And then, so you have two categories of these legal instruments: collective rights and those that criminalize discrimination. So this is what we call anti-discrimination law or racial equality law. And so these instruments have been adopted, but then of course they look good on paper, and what is done with them in the practice of the legal systems in the region is another thing. So
yes, and I was reading about that. You sent me an article, which is very interesting, because in the United States after the Civil War, they created the Jim Crow laws to basically keep segregation in place, and in South Africa they had the apartheid laws. So those were actually written laws that were racist. And so you're saying in Latin America, even with laws, anti-racist laws in place, you have what's called a customary law, which is basically, they're not written, but it's just basically something that's passed down, and it's what actually happens in the country to basically keep a systematic racism in place.
That's exactly right. Customary law was not changed at all by what I call that race regulation. Customary law was not changed a bit by the adoption of multiculturalism and the adoption of these legal instruments, the creation of these legal instruments. So, because the application of these instruments continues to be polluted by race regulation, customary law. So even today, in multicultural Latin America, where you have all of these laws which aim to fight discrimination and racism, and which aim to recognize collective rights to indigenous people and Afro-descendants, despite the existence of these laws, the practice is far from respecting the spirit and the content of these legal instruments.
Now, interestingly enough, that's basically where your organization that you created comes in. So like I mentioned in the beginning, Professor Rahier is the director of Ojalá, which is the Observatory for Justice of Afro-descendants in Latin America. And I love what the professor's doing with this organization, because you're basically going to the root of the problem, which is basically helping people of Afro-descendants in the legal realm. And what he's creating, and he's going to explain better than me, is basically a virtual repertory of all the legal cases having to do with discrimination against Afro-descendants in Latin America, and putting them all together, right? So that when lawyers of different countries need to refer back to, and you can explain a little bit better, they can have this sort of database of collective legal cases that have already taken place with regards to discrimination. Can you expand on that a little bit, please?
Yeah, so the Observatory of Justice for Afro-descendants in Latin America, Ojalá, we function in 3 languages, English, Portuguese, and Spanish. And as a few major objectives. So all of them are aimed at producing knowledge that will be useful to improve the lives of Afro-descendants. It's a knowledge about the functioning of the Latin American legal systems. And so the departure point of Ojalá is that we are aware of the existence of these legal instruments, but we want to see how are these legal instruments applied in the court of law and in the practice, the daily practice of each one of the Latin American justice systems, in each one of the Latin American national contexts. And we are doing a number of things. So we are conducting research. We are in the process of preparing a big NSF research grant, a National Science Foundation research grant. And we look at specific cases in each country, and we look at the way these instruments were eventually applied or not, and why. And so, and that, of course, allows us to perhaps produce assessments of the application of these instruments, and also eventually propose policy changes. But the major, one of the major objectives, and you made reference to it, is that we want to create a digital repository of legal archives, of cases, legal cases, from all the regions, from each one of the Latin American national contexts, in which what we call ethno-racial law, which is this law that either criminalizes discrimination or recognizes collective rights, were in use, in which ethno-racial law was in use. And so we want to make these archives of each case, each relevant case, in our website, in our repository, so that they can be available to researchers, to students, but also to attorneys who are litigating new cases for the defense of Afro-descendant rights in their respective countries. So in making the repository accessible online to these attorneys, we are in fact facilitating the creation of a regional jurisprudence.
Jurisprudence, that's the word that I had learned last time. Yeah. Can you tell them what jurisprudence means?
So jurisprudence refers in the practice of legal systems to the way a particular law has been applied in the past. So, when a judge or a jury needs to make a decision in a given case using a specific law, they must take into consideration how that law has been applied in the past. And that must inform the way they are going to apply that law in the present. So with human rights law, you may create a jurisprudence regionally, even though the instruments in use are not exactly the same, but nonetheless, the spirit and of the application of these instruments can be useful to a particular attorney. Let me say it differently because it's a bit confusing. So if an attorney in Uruguay wants to, is litigating a case in which an Afro-Uruguayan person was a victim of racism, that attorney can look if there were other cases of anti-Black racism in any of the other countries of the region, and eventually inspire himself and use references to these cases in order to solidify the argument he will be developing and presenting in court.
Got it. So it's making reference to other cases where they're similar cases. So in order to make their case stronger for the person being discriminated against.
That's exactly right. And so we will then make it so easy for attorneys litigating new cases to access these various cases, because we want to create a repository which will be easily accessible. We want to develop, and we are at the beginning of our life as an observatory. We created ourselves, or the observatory, in 2018. So we still very new, But and so we will create a guide, because of course the legal archives are organized differently in different national contexts, and so therefore you need to have a guide to make it easy for the visitor of the repository to. And so this is one of the things that we are going to be, looking for funding. We are very actively looking for funding in order to help the production of this knowledge and make that knowledge easily accessible to everyone.
And knowledge is power, like they say. I think this is so important, because if you make this type of things accessible to the lawyers who need it, and a lot of times their clients are poor, and they need help in being able to defend, their client against maybe somebody who has more economic power. They need access to this knowledge in order to make their cases stronger. So, I mean, I think that this is something that will definitely help the anti-racist movement and in Latin America. So I think this is of utmost importance.
Oh, yeah, yeah. And in a way, we see, I mean, we are completely different, but in a way we have some similarity. What we want to do, what we would like to be able to do will be a bit what one of the strategies that the NAACP here in the United States adopted. The NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, in the 60s, because this is an organization that emerges with the movement for civil rights of Afro-descendants and everyone in this country, in the United States. They had an arm that was regrouping attorneys and people who because once the laws are adopted, it doesn't mean that they're going to be applied. So you need to have a strategy in order for the laws to be applied properly.
Yeah, and to work for the people.
For the people, with respect of the spirit of the law, of the spirit in which the law was, of the spirit of the legislators when they created that law.
Yes.
To fight against racism. And so this was a major strategy, political, legal strategy of the NAACP, was to make sure and observe what's going on in the entire 50 states of the country, and delegate and send attorneys to litigate and to have the laws actually applied and respected.
That's so interesting. Now let's go down from the law and speak a little bit about how this really affects people in real life, because you sent me an article that I was of course, since I'm Venezuelan, it was the first one I read, and it was called "The Multicultural Invisibility of Afro-Venezuelans and the Alternative Legal Politics to Fight Racial Discrimination and Acquire Ethno-Racial Recognition." So the legal case against Cinecita. So I was reading, and it was very interesting, and because it was basically saying, and I want you to correct me if I'm wrong, that basically there was a digital job advertisement that explicitly requested employees with white skin. So that's a racist job advertisement, and it's out there. And it's interesting because when I told my parents about this, my parents were not shocked at all. They were like, "Valentina, not only racism, but ageism. Like in Venezuela, they remember ads like," and they would even say the gender, like a woman between the age of 20 and 25, like the cutoff, it was also, it's very outright racism. It's not even hidden. It's really blatant.
Oh yeah. And those things happen while many Venezuelans will nonetheless, in some certain context, and I say Venezuelan, but it could be any Latin American person,
yes,
will, and when I say Venezuelan or any Latin American country, I'm not talking about Afro-descendants. I'm talking about the non-Afro-descendants. Many of them will say, "Oh no, there is no racism here. There is no racism here." And so that's why, the best person to tell you if there is racism or not are the persons who are suffering it.
Are the ones who are suffering, exactly.
From it. Yeah. So, No, so that's a case. In that case, in that article, our colleague makes reference to the fact that there is an invisibility of Afro-descendants in the multicultural Venezuela, because the multiculturalism in Venezuela is particular because it recognizes as a people, un pueblo, and the indigenous people, but not the Afro-descendants.
Not the Afro-descendants.
So Afro-descendants are not subject of the law that recognize collective rights. They have no existence as a collective in Venezuela.
That's
like
very,
indigenous people.
Yeah, and that's very interesting, because the other thing that I saw that was like, wow, is how social media is really having an impact in giving a voice to people who prior to this were completely invisible. Is that correct? Because they were saying that basically social media were they were the ones to basically push for an anti-racist digital community. So you're able to have a medium that we didn't have before.
Exactly, but be careful. Social media can go anyway. So
anyway, that's the problem.
Expressing himself or herself on social media. You have both the KKK or the racist on the social media and the anti-racist on the social media. So everyone is, but that's, of course, it's a space in which you may eventually engage in very, in impactful activism. And that was the case in that. That's what happened in that legal case, is that the activism of certain organizations and movement leaders was very successful in fighting against anti-Black racism.
Now, the other thing is that I find very interesting, and the conversation that we had the previous week, and then me looking at all of this, is a lot of these racist actions are very hidden, sort of like you said, blanketed, right? There's a lot of things that are nuances that we don't even realize we have.
Oh, exactly. Un racismo solapado, and which invades all aspects of daily life. Of course, you have that. But on the other hand, in all countries of the region, you also have racism up in your face.
Up in your face. So it's
not
like
all racism, and that's the cases that the special issue that I guest edited, that I send you, is focused on legal cases in which the racism was quite straightforwardly.
Yes. I mean, I've heard and I've seen some people that are not even allowed to go into banks because of the color of their skin.
Oh, yeah.
Or they're blatantly denied things such as loans and
oh yeah. Or if you want an employee, a bank employee, usually you're not gonna have Black people in many Latin American countries. The teller, the person as a bank teller, and so on. There are many young people in a number of countries complain about that. And thanks to these laws, to the existence of these laws, they could, if they have the right social and financial capital, eventually go to court in order to seek for redress and put an end to these practices. But most people who are subjected to that don't have the time to do that, they don't know how to approach an attorney. And so on, and prefer to then find a job. If they can't get that job because of racism, they will continue because they are in need of feeding their families and so on. And you can't stop your life all the time to fight racism. That's the privilege, like us in academia or those who have the jobs we have. We have the
brain space to be able to discuss these subjects. Yes.
And also the time we can. That's part of our job,
yes.
And the people who are looking to feed their families and so on, they don't have spare time for that. Yeah.
And that's why it's so important for and I know a lot of people are talking about this right now. That's why it's so important for people, for not only Blacks to talk about this subject. I think it takes a collective group of people to all become aware of the subject and to help lift everybody up, so that, because it can't only be, and I feel the same way even for like sexism. It can't just be women fighting for women. There has to come a point where men also give women a voice, and where white people give Black people a voice. It has to be a collective effort. Endeavor, yes, to end all sorts of discrimination. Professor, it's, and I want to say, I want to touch this at the end of the podcast, is what are the subtle things, because, changing the world to, to most people seems impossible. But I think that there's certain things that can be done in households that are small things, but they're actually things that matter. And I asked you the other time, I said, I have a question. Is the word mulatto a bad word? Because as far as I knew, it was a term of endearment. In Venezuela, we use it all the time. And then when you told me what it actually meant, I was horrified. And I thought about it all week long. The words like this, tell everybody where the word mulatto comes from.
Yeah, so that comes from, of course, the observation that many of the vocabularies that have been in use in the 20th and 21st century are in fact inherited from 19th century scientific racism as it developed in Europe and in North America. So mulatto, the biological sciences were not always what they are today. In the 19th century, the biological knowledge was very limited, but that didn't prevent some people to produce theories which were racist theories, which put, Black people at the bottom and white people on top, and a few people, different other people in the middle. And so, but mulatto comes from it comes from the observation of the fact that when a horse, if a horse mates with a donkey, it will produce a mule, and the mules, in fact, are a cross between two species of animals, and the mule cannot reproduce. They cannot reproduce. So if you want new mules, you're going to have to go back to the horse and the donkey. And so so they were convinced that the cross or the mixing between a white person and a Black person was creating a being that they interpreted as, comparable to the mule.
Yeah,
and that's
horrible.
Where the term mule, mulata comes from. It comes from these theories that existed in the 19th century about the crosses between different species.
Wow. When you actually know where something comes from and what the actual context is, it changes, and it makes you want to, obviously change your vocabulary. That's why it's so important to have awareness about these topics. Any other words, there's so many racist terms that we use. I mean, you talked about one of them, el blancamiento, the whitening of the race, the bettering of the race, make your race whiter to better it, in sorts of, it's very widely commonly used in Latin America. That's for sure a Latin American thing.
And it's a obvious racist. It's based on this racial hierarchy.
Yeah, of course.
You want to move away from the bottom and
go to the move up. Exactly.
But one thing that one has to really, if we want to make a difference in the world, and particularly in the region, in Latin America, is that everyone should carefully listen to those who suffer from discrimination and racial hatred, but also we all individually must deconstruct and destroy the stereotypes.
Absolutely. The stereotypes hurt us so much.
Yeah, that continue to circulate innocently, you know, in the press or in soap operas, in TV shows, and in a number of in songs and so forth. So
you know, talking about songs, when I right before I turned on Zoom to do our interview, I thought of a song that, you know, for anybody that says Latin America doesn't have racism, I mean, this is the song. I don't know if you've heard. It's by El Grupo Nietzsche. And it's called Han Cogido la Cosa. It's a very famous salsa song, a very good one. Yeah. Que para reírse se burlan de mí, han cogido la cosa, que para reírse se agarran a mí, que tengo grande la boca y la nariz, que nada bueno no me encuentran a mí, que yo soy prieto, que soy carabalí, pero orgulloso me siento y así. And then he goes on to say, if you're a white man, you're an athlete. If you're a black man, you know, you're a criminal. And but he's very explicitly saying, like, it brings awareness to the subject, and I think it's very telling of our society. You know.
Oh no, mami, que será lo que quiere el negro, no?
Que será lo que yes, oh my God.
Yeah, that's another song. No, there are so many songs. Like,
there's so many songs.
So many.
No le pega a la negra, no le pega a la negra. That talks about colonialism. And
no, that one is a critique. Is a critique
of course,
of
it's
racism.
A critique. Yeah. This one I told you too is also a critique.
Yeah. But you know, so there are so many anti-black racism is found in so many, even in advertisement. You know.
In the beauty queen pageants, Professor, I was talking to my friend Jorna. She's from Colombia, and she was like saying, Valentina, how many? Because like Venezuela, for example, like was always so proud of their beauty queens, but how many of those beauty queens, you know, were of Afro descent? It's but almost like. Yeah.
I've also written on beauty queens.
Oh, really? You see?
Contest but mostly in Ecuador. You know, I think it was in 1996, there was in Ecuador the first black woman elected Reina del Ecuador. So I wrote a piece on that, and also how she came to be and what she faced once elected. You know, Monica Chala is her name.
Oh, we need to attach that one to the blog too.
Oh, I'll send you all of these pieces after we finish the conversation. But yeah, you know, so anti-black racism finds its place everywhere, and so I would say, you know, something also that I'm somewhat encouraged, although not naively, I'm too old for that, is that right now in the United States is that with the movement that took place since the assassination of George Floyd and in Atlanta a couple of days ago and so on, is that you do now have a disposition of American society as never before, I would suspect, that to listen and to really realize what it means to suffer from anti-black racism every day. I mean, you cannot, do you understand, live your life normally. You have to constantly, you can think about yourself as being, you know, for instance, a young man, I'm a young man, but if you are in certain situation, you must make an effort to take into consideration how a policeman is looking at you. He's not looking at you as a teenager who is doing things. He's looking at you as a dangerous, do you understand, a predator, social predator. A young white man will be able to do things that a young white man will be able to do things that a young black man cannot do. You see the case of these two young men who are arrested for jaywalking in a street where there is no sidewalk. And so where the hell do you want them to walk if not on the street? So do you understand? This is quite surprising. I mean, it's quite edifying and that doesn't happen to young white men when they walk on the street. You understand? So this is a reality that the people who are not subjected to anti-Black racism, to really listen and make an effort to put themselves in the place of the mothers and the brothers and you understand the children and who are suffering that constant aggression and negativity.
Yes, I think that's the key for human unity in general, is for us to be able to listen to one another, because we all have different experiences. And when we're able to put, like you said, when we're able to put ourselves in the other person's shoe, see life from that other person's perspective, and really listen, then we're able to come together and say, you know what? Wow, I don't want that for you. And not only that, it's like, I can't possibly imagine what it must feel like, but it sounds awful.
Exactly. That's exactly right. And that's the good thing about the present moment, is that it eventually gives us hope that things might change, because you see the multiraciality, the multiracial dimension of these rallies, these marches.
Yes.
Not just Black people in the street, there are a whole bunch of different people who say, the young people, they say, we don't want that. That's not the way, this is we. And then some people didn't realize that these things were happening. There were some I've even seen on, which is, as a Black person, surprising, but not so surprising. There are white people who might not have realized that things were that bad.
Yes, yeah. And I think this subject is a subject I'm saying that causes a lot of shame, even in, on both sides. There's like the side that realizes that their descendants were despicable, that they did things that were horrible to other human beings, and that carries a lot of shame for it. And then there's a shame of not feeling like, well, when am I going to be seen? When am I going to be enough? Why do I have to prove myself and other people don't seem to have to do the same? Why am I constantly fighting for approval? Why am I constantly fighting for visibility, like you said?
Exactly.
These are and I think also we need to keep the momentum for this cause. We can't just let this be a little moment in time. I really do think it needs to be a wave that continues to move forward, and the discussion needs to be continued so that our children's generation is better, and then their children's generation is better, and so on and so forth.
Exactly.
Thank you so much for being on with us. I'm going to be posting also, for anyone who wants to donate to this amazing cause, to Ojalá, I'm going to be putting the link on the website, and also the links of the different articles. Go ahead.
And then the link, not just the link, the indications I placed, because Ojalá exists within the Latin American and Caribbean Center, LAC. Mm-hmm. And so there is a way. You remember I gave you the steps on
how to be able to donate. Yes. So we're gonna.
And what they have to do, and what they should do, is also send me an email. They deposit the money there if they are willing to donate for this great cause that Ojalá represents. And so they donate there, and then they eventually send me an email
as a confirmation,
telling me that they have deposited. Because if not, we don't know. There are many causes for lack.
Okay.
And the only way to mark that donation for Ojalá is to send me an email.
Perfect.
Indicating that the donation has been made. You understand?
Sounds good. But this is a really good cause. I mean, it has to do with the law, with changing and creating, like you said, a database of knowledge, and to really make something that's tangible difference in Latin America. Also, if you guys want to comment on this blog post, it's going to be under mamasconganas.com/37. Thanks again, Professor. I know this is not the last time we're going to see each other.
And my email is Rahier. You'll put my email on the rahier@fiu.edu.
Yes, and Rahier is Rahier.
Exactly.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure.